You ever hear a headline so bold, so brash, so layered with silent arrogance, that it makes you stop and just stare at the screen like, wait, did they really say that? If Isro succeeds in landing on the moon, then it will be humiliating for Russia. That's what the BBC said. That's what they put out there, as if success, Indian success, is somehow a threat, not a victory for humanity, not a celebration of science, but a humiliation for someone else. That right there, that tells you everything you need to know about how uncomfortable the world becomes when underdogs rise. But let me tell you something. Real champions never ask for permission to rise. They rise anyway, quietly, consistently, without applause, and that's exactly what ISRO has done for decades. While space programs around the world flaunted budgets and broadcasted power, ISRO stayed the course. They didn't enter the space race to compete for headlines. They entered to push boundaries of what was possible, of what was practical, and of what was previously only reserved for so-called superpowers. Do you think Russia is humiliated by Isro's success? No. You know who's humiliated? Those who thought India would never make it. Those who ridiculed the idea that a nation with limited resources could do what billion-dollar agencies struggled to do. And now, when India puts a rover on the moon, the narrative suddenly shifts. It's no longer a milestone. It's a threat, a loss, a competition. Why? Because it didn't come from where they expected greatness to come from. You ever notice how the world gets real quiet when someone they underestimated starts to win? It's not just shock. It's discomfort. Because unexpected success threatens the comfortable. It shakes the foundation of what they thought they knew. When ISRO set out to land on the moon, nobody outside that mission room thought it would rattle the world. But it did. Not because it was just a technological leap. Not because it was just India doing it. But because success came from a place the world never expected it to. A place they conveniently ignored. And now that success has shown up at the front door, loud and clear, people don't know what to do with it. They don't celebrate it. They label it as humiliating. For someone else, that's not about rockets. That's about ego. See, when you've been sitting at the top for too long, you start thinking you're untouchable. That the spotlight belongs to you by default. So when someone comes from the background, from the quiet corners of the world, and not only matches your achievement, but does it with fewer resources, less recognition, and more heart, it doesn't just challenge your status. It exposes it. That's what ISRO did. They exposed the illusion that only a few nations could lead. And suddenly, people aren't talking about the moon landing as a human milestone. They're scrambling to protect their pride. That tells you everything. It's not the success itself that bothers them. It's the source of that success. Let's call it for what it is. The moment ISRO's lunar mission got global attention, it stopped being about space and started being about status. This wasn't about celebrating a scientific achievement. This was about control. Because when a nation like India, often overlooked and underestimated, dares to rise and succeeds, the narrative shifts and fast. Suddenly, it's not, look at what humanity achieved. It's, what does this mean for Russia? The spotlight gets pulled away from the breakthrough and redirected toward political rivalry. That's not science. That's fear of losing dominance. This is where you need to be sharp. Because people will mask insecurity as analysis. They'll twist inspiration into competition. A moon landing becomes a threat. Success becomes a humiliation. Not because it is, but because it came from someone they weren't ready to respect. So now they reframe the story. They want you looking at who's embarrassed, not who should be admired. But smart people don't get caught in that. Smart people see it for what it isn't, a power play. And they remember that the ones trying to shift the narrative are the ones most afraid of change. Real champions don't wait for a green light. They don't stand around waiting for validation, applause, or an invitation to rise. They rise anyway. And ISRO is the perfect example of that kind of unapologetic focus. They didn't wait for the world to recognize their brilliance. They didn't beg for the spotlight. They didn't ask to be taken seriously. They just put their heads down and did the work. Over years, through failures, through doubt, through being underestimated. Because when you truly believe in your mission, you don't need permission to pursue it. You execute, regardless of who's watching, regardless of who believes in you. That's the kind of mindset that separates people who dream from people who deliver. While other nations were out broadcasting big plans and budgets, ISRO was building. While people questioned their capability, they stayed in the lab, refining. While critics laughed, they plotted coordinates to the moon. That's what happens when you know who you are. You don't waste energy proving it. You let your work prove it for you. ISRO never shouted. They never competed for noise. They competed with excellence. And that's exactly why the world had no choice but to notice when it happened. Strength doesn't always walk into the room making noise. Sometimes, it walks in quiet, disciplined, and deadly focused. That's ISRO. You don't see them parading achievements. You see them refining systems. You don't hear them boasting in front of cameras. You see them calculating. Quietly, meticulously, relentlessly. That's silent strength. That's the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because it knows exactly what it's doing and where it's going. While others are obsessed with optics, ISRO is obsessed with outcomes. They've mastered the art of staying under the radar while pushing past it. No oversized budgets, no PR spectacle, no space drama. Just a mission, a purpose, and the kind of mental toughness most people can't comprehend. That's what real strength looks like. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's not arrogant. It's composed, strategic, and always 5 steps ahead. People often mistake silence for weakness, but silence backed by preparation is deadly. And by the time the world realizes that, it's already too late. The rocket has launched, the objective has been hit, and ISRO is already planning the next move. Criticism for most people feels like a wall. For ISRO, it was a stepping stone. Every time they were mocked for launching with less, for aiming too high, for dreaming beyond their budget. Every one of those doubts became fuel. That's the difference between people who break and people who build. Most fold under pressure. ISR turned it into purpose. Because when you're on a mission bigger than yourself, criticism stops being personal. It becomes part of the process. They didn't let the noise distract them. They didn't flinch when their failures made headlines. They just kept building. You've got to understand this. Resilience isn't about pretending you're not affected. It's about refusing to be stopped. Every failed launch, every skeptical headline, every smirk from another agency. ISRO absorbed it all and used it. That's tactical patience. That's focus. And it's rare. Most people want revenge with words. ISRO wanted results. And that kind of mindset, it doesn't just silence critics. It makes them irrelevant. Because once the work is done and the mission is complete, the same people who laughed are forced to sit down and watch. When ISRO touched down on the moon, it wasn't just a moment for India. It was a mirror held up to the world. And what that mirror reflected back made a lot of people uncomfortable. Because ISRO's win wasn't just about technology. It was about proving that the world had been watching the wrong people. Cheering for the loudest. Betting on the biggest. And ignoring the most disciplined. You want to talk about humiliation. The real humiliation wasn't Russia's. The real humiliation belonged to those who refused to see the quiet rise of excellence right in front of them. When people talk about ISRO's success as some kind of humiliation for another nation, they're not really talking about Russia. They're talking about their own fear. The fear that their grip on superiority is slipping. That the so-called developing world is no longer waiting for permission to show up on the big stage. And that scares them. Because when someone you never considered competition beats you, without the same resources, without the same network, without the same visibility, it's not just a blow to your pride, it's a wake-up call. There's a special kind of arrogance that comes from being on top for too long. It makes people believe they're untouchable. It makes them believe that the rules they made will always protect their place. So when someone like ISRO rises up from what the world thought was the back of the line and nails what others have failed to do, the reaction isn't always applause. It's resistance. It's deflection. It's narrative control. Suddenly, it's not about how brilliant the mission was. It's about who lost face because of it. That's not reporting. That's spin. And that spin reveals exactly who's threatened by truth. It's human nature to downplay what we fear, to make someone else's victory look like a fluke. But what happened with ISRO wasn't luck. It wasn't a one-time miracle. It was the result of years, decades, of calculated, persistent, relentless work. That kind of consistency terrifies people who rely on legacy instead of effort, because Isro didn't ride on prestige. They didn't inherit their success. They earned it. Step by step, test by test, mission by mission. While others were building press conferences, they were building precision. Think about what that means. Not just for India, but for anyone who's ever been told they're too small to make a dent. Anyone who's ever been doubted because of where they come from or how little they started with. That moon landing wasn't just a scientific milestone. It was a message. Excellence doesn't care about your expectations. It doesn't wait for your respect. It forces it, and that's exactly what Isro did. You have to understand, success doesn't humiliate people. Ego does. It's ego that makes someone else's victory feel like a threat. It's ego that turns admiration into resentment. And it's ego that cannot handle being outperformed by someone it once looked down on. That's why the word, humiliating, even made it into that headline. Because when you've built your identity on the idea that you're always first, always best, and always right, watching someone else rise feels like a collapse. But that collapse isn't caused by the winner. It's caused by the fragility of the observer. What Isro did was offer the world a different kind of leadership. One rooted in humility, consistency, and action. No fireworks, no chest beating, just results. That kind of leadership is powerful because it doesn't seek validation. It creates its own value. It doesn't need anyone's blessing. It just shows up and delivers. And that's what really rattles people. Because you can't ignore that kind of power. You can't spin it away. You can't silence it when it's already on the scoreboard. This is bigger than space. This is about how we respond to greatness when it doesn't come from where we expect it to. Do we celebrate it? Do we learn from it? Or do we get defensive and start pointing fingers? What the world chooses in moments like these says more about us than it does about Isro, because how we treat someone else's success reveals our own character. You see someone winning, and you feel humiliated. That's not on them. That's on you. Now take that same lens and point it at your own life. How do you react when someone you overlooked rises? When someone you thought was behind you suddenly moves ahead? Do you clap, or do you compete? Do you shrink, or do you step up? That's the test. Because success will always expose the truth, not just about the one who wins, but about everyone watching. Isro never said a word about competition. They never positioned themselves as a threat. But their results spoke louder than any accusation, any headline, any dismissal. And that's the part people can't handle. That kind of silent confidence is unsettling to those who rely on being seen to feel valuable. Isro didn't demand to be seen. They just did the work until the world couldn't not look. Greatness doesn't belong to a zip code. It doesn't need to be dressed in luxury, backed by billions, or broadcasted from a high rise. Greatness is built wherever discipline meets vision, whether that's in Silicon Valley, Moscow, or a small lab in Bengaluru. That's what Isro showed the world. For too long, people assumed that only certain countries, certain cultures, certain economies were meant to lead. That success somehow had a flag or a brand label. But when Isro made it to the moon, that myth got shattered. Because there was no billion-dollar launch party, no global PR rollout, just engineers with a mission and a mindset that said, we'll do it differently, and we'll do it better. This is where people get it twisted. They think power has to look a certain way, loud, expensive, dressed in status. But real power, it's quiet, it's resourceful, it figures things out when the tools are limited, it adapts, it evolves, and it never stops. That's Isro. That's what happens when you stop obsessing over how things look and start focusing on how things work. And when you operate like that, you don't just close the gap, you become the new standard. People weren't just surprised by Isro's success, they were disoriented, because it came from a place they weren't watching. That's the danger of arrogance. It makes you blind to excellence unless it wears a familiar uniform. But Isro didn't show up to fit anyone's mold. They built their own blueprint, and then they executed it flawlessly. That's what greatness does. It doesn't knock. It walks in through the side door and rewrites the entire system without asking for permission. So, if you've ever been told that where you come from limits where you're going, remember this, it's not about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to work when no one's watching. It's about how committed you are when the odds are against you. Isro didn't rise because the world gave them space. They rose because they took it, quietly, relentlessly. And now the world has no choice but to listen. There's a certain kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. And that's the kind of power Isro owns. They don't show up screaming. They don't need drama, headlines, or a global stage to validate their work. Because when you're that focused, that strategic, and that locked into purpose, you let the results speak. And the loudest results often come from the quietest rooms. While others are busy making noise, Isro is busy making history. That's the mark of real confidence. You don't need to be seen every second to know your value. You know what you're building. You know what's coming, and you know it'll speak for itself when the time is right. Loud success is often insecure success. It's bloated with the need for applause. But Isro's path was different. They weren't chasing attention. They were chasing precision. Every move was calculated, deliberate, disciplined. And when they finally landed on the moon, they didn't scream, "Look at us." The world just couldn't look away. That's the power of winning in silence. It doesn't just demand respect. It commands it. And the people who underestimated you, they don't even know how to respond, because you didn't give them the satisfaction of a fight. You just delivered. And that delivery didn't come from arrogance. It came from alignment. When you know your mission, you don't waste time trying to prove yourself to people who were never rooting for you in the first place. You don't justify your work. You show it. And Isro didn't need to tell the world they were capable. They showed them with data, with trajectory, with landing gear that touched the lunar surface while the critics were still laughing. That's how you flip the narrative. Not with words, but with wins. Let them doubt. Let them talk. Let them wonder how you did it. Just don't get caught in the noise. The people who are loud today will be silent tomorrow. And you'll still be rising. Most people want the finish line, but they're not built for the process. They want the glory, the praise, the viral moment, but they don't want the grind that comes before it. That's where Isro stands apart. They didn't chase glory. They chased excellence every day. Without recognition, without the world cheering them on. And that's what makes them dangerous. Because the underdog who trains in silence, who sharpens their skills without the need for attention, becomes unstoppable when the lights finally hit. What Isro built wasn't just a rocket. It was a blueprint for resilience. While others had the money, the fame, the legacy, Isro had one thing they never lost: a grit. That's the foundation of every win that matters. You don't get to extraordinary by doing what's comfortable. You get there by choosing discipline over distraction, purpose over popularity. And Isro made that choice every single day, long before the headlines, long before the global attention. They weren't obsessed with looking successful. They were obsessed with being successful. That's why they tested relentlessly, learned from failure, true strength, and kept going when no one outside their walls believed they would make it. Because when you're committed to the process, you stop needing the world's permission to believe in your outcome. And Isro believed, even when missions failed, even when critics laughed, even when global media questioned their capability. They stayed locked in. That's the kind of mental toughness that builds real legacy. Most people want success to feel exciting. They want the hype, the adrenaline,